The chains around Sergeant James Jim Walker's wrists clanked as he was led into the cold, silent courtroom. It was the last place on earth he wanted to be. For 5 years, he had sat in a concrete box, labeled a murderer, cast aside like garbage by the same country he had once sworn to protect. They said he killed his commanding officer, a man he had respected, a man he had fought beside. They said the evidence was undeniable. But Jim knew the truth. He didn't pull the trigger, yet here he was, branded a criminal, his future buried beneath a life sentence. The judge sat at the bench, flipping through a thick file of legal papers, Jim's case file, his sentence, his fate. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating, filled with the whispers of onlookers, journalists, and the murmurs of the prosecution. They thought this was the end for him. But Jim had one last request. "Sergeant Walker," the judge finally spoke, voice tired, as if he had already decided Jim wasn't worth his time. "You have been convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison without parole. Do you have any final requests before sentencing is carried out?" Jim gripped the metal railing in front of him, knuckles white. His chains rattled. His voice, though hoarse from years of silence, came out firm, unshaken. "I want to see my K9 partner." The courtroom stilled. Even the judge looked up, brows furrowing. Jim kept his gaze forward, unwavering. "His name is Ranger. He served with me. He was taken from me the day I was arrested." Silence stretched through the courtroom, thick and uneasy. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "This is ridiculous. The military doesn't allow prisoners to interact with active K9 units." Jim didn't blink. "I want to see him. One last time." The judge exhaled slowly. "Sergeant Walker, this isn't a... I trained him, I raised him. He saved my life more times than I can count." Jim's voice was steel now, unyielding. "I need to say goodbye." A long pause. Then, to everyone's shock, the judge nodded. "Request granted." The prosecution exploded in protest, but the judge slammed the gavel down. "Lieutenant Ranger will be brought in, one supervised visit." Jim exhaled, feeling something in his chest loosen, just slightly. He was going to see his partner again. But what Jim didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Ranger's reaction would change everything. 2 hours later, Jim was brought back into the courtroom, this time without chains on his hands. He barely noticed. His heart was hammering in his chest, his muscles tight with a mixture of hope and fear. Would Ranger even remember him? Military K9s were trained to move on after reassignment. Would he look at Jim like a stranger? He braced himself for the worst. Then the doors opened, and Ranger entered the room. The large Belgian Malinois strode in, led by a uniformed military officer, his posture rigid, controlled. His fur was sleek, his body still muscular despite the passing years. Jim couldn't breathe. Ranger looked around the courtroom, scanning faces, until his eyes landed on Jim. The air shifted. Something ancient, unbreakable, unspoken passed between them. For a moment, Ranger didn't move. Then, the dog's posture broke. A whimper escaped his throat. The officer holding his leash barely had time to react before Ranger lunged forward, not in aggression, but in desperation. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Jim barely had time to kneel before Ranger slammed into him, nearly knocking him over. The dog let out a deep, low whine, pressing his massive head into Jim's chest, paws scrabbling at his uniform, as if trying to climb into his arms. The leash was still attached, but Ranger didn't care. He buried his face into Jim's shoulder, whining, trembling, pressing so hard against him that it was as if he was trying to merge into him. Jim gripped his fur, shaking. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "I'm here." Tears burned in his eyes, but they weren't just his. Ranger's handler, the soldier who had brought him in, stood frozen, mouth slightly open. I've never seen him act like this," the soldier stammered. "He's never reacted to anyone this way." The prosecutor was speechless. The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, his expression unreadable. Even the jury looked shaken. Military K9s were trained for discipline, for restraint. They weren't supposed to show emotion. They weren't supposed to disobey direct orders. And yet, Ranger was refusing to let go of Jim. The courtroom wasn't just watching a dog and his former handler reunite. They were watching proof that Jim Walker wasn't the man they thought he was. Because K9s didn't react to criminals like this. They reacted to brothers. to family, to men who had never broken their trust. And in that moment, everyone in that room began to doubt. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. "Order in the court." Ranger whimpered, still refusing to leave Jim's side. The prosecutor was scrambling now, standing up. "This is emotional manipulation. This proves nothing." Jim looked up, something sharp and deadly in his gaze. "This dog was there the night of the murder," Jim said, his voice controlled but lethal. He saw what happened. The room went silent. Jim stared at the judge. "If you really believe I'm guilty, prove it. Let me put Ranger to the test." The judge hesitated. "How?" Jim slowly stood, looking directly at Ranger. He took a deep breath, then said one word: "Seek." A tense, almost suffocating silence filled the courtroom. All eyes were on Ranger. The judge sat frozen, gavel still raised but forgotten. The jury shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at the massive Belgian Malinois still pressed against Sergeant James Walker. The prosecutor's face twisted in frustration. "This is absurd," he snapped, slamming a hand down on his desk. "Are we seriously entertaining the idea that a dog can determine the outcome of a murder trial?" Jim barely heard him. His entire focus was on Ranger. The dog was trembling, not in fear, but in recognition. His deep brown eyes locked onto Jim's, ears twitching at every tiny shift in his body language. Jim knew this dog better than anyone, and right now, Ranger was telling him something. Jim took a slow breath and gave the command again. "Seek." For a second, nothing happened. Then, Ranger's entire demeanor shifted. The dog's ears perked, his nose flared, his muscles tensed like a coiled spring. Then, he turned his head sharply, not toward Jim, not toward the jury, but toward the prosecutor. A deep, gut-wrenching growl rumbled from his chest, so low it sent shivers down Jim's spine. The prosecutor flinched. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, backing up a step. Ranger's hackles raised, his tail stiff, his entire body shifting into attack mode. Jim stood slowly, his pulse hammered in his ears. "You remember something, don't you, boy?" he said, his voice calm, measured. Ranger didn't blink, didn't move, didn't acknowledge anyone else in the courtroom except for the prosecutor. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "Someone stop that animal!" the prosecutor shouted. "He's dangerous!" "He's not dangerous!" Jim shot back, voice sharp as a blade. "He's reacting to something." The judge slammed the gavel. "Order in the court!" But the room had already shifted. The jury was watching now, not the lawyers, not Jim, but Ranger. And he wasn't moving. He was locked in, locked onto something, onto someone. Jim's mind raced. Ranger was a military K-9, trained to track scents, detect threats, and recognize past experiences. And right now, he was identifying someone he remembered from that night. Jim's hands curled into fists. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, let the record show that Ranger is reacting to the prosecution, not me." The judge hesitated. "This is highly—" "I want the dog removed," the prosecutor snapped. He was panicking now, and Jim saw it. Everyone saw it. Ranger's growl deepened, the low sound vibrating through the floor. Jim wasn't about to let this moment slip away. "5 years ago," Jim said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, forcing everyone to listen. "Ranger was with me when Captain Reese was killed. He was trained to remember the scene, and now he's reacting to you." The prosecutor's face drained of color. "That's ridiculous," he muttered, but his hands were shaking. Jim took a step forward. "You were on base that night, weren't you?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew into a buzz of tension. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. "This is a stunt. A dog can't testify. You have no—" "Then why is he looking at you?" Silence. Everyone waited. Then Ranger moved, fast. Before anyone could react, the dog lunged, not to attack, but to grab. His powerful jaws clamped onto the prosecutor's sleeve, yanking him back, sending papers flying from the desk. And that's when it happened. A small metallic object tumbled from the inside of the prosecutor's coat pocket, hitting the floor with a tiny clink. For a split second, no one moved. Then Jim's breath caught in his chest. It was a military-issue keycard, one with the exact insignia of the base where Captain Reese was murdered. The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor's face twisted in sheer panic. He lunged to grab the keycard, but Jim was faster. He snatched it up, holding it high. "What the hell are you doing with a security pass to the crime scene?" The room exploded with voices. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" The prosecutor backed up, stammering. I don't. The door to the courtroom slammed open. A team of military investigators rushed in, armed with files and papers. One of them, a tall, stone-faced officer, walked straight to the judge. "Your Honor," the officer announced, voice cold as steel, "we have new evidence that implicates the prosecution in a cover-up surrounding Captain Reese's murder." The courtroom erupted again. Jim felt the air rush out of his lungs. For 5 years, he had been fighting for this moment, and now it was happening. The prosecutor tried to run. Ranger snapped to attention, growled, and lunged forward, blocking the man's path with a snarl. A guard moved in, grabbing the prosecutor, pinning him against the desk. Jim stood frozen, watching as the very man who had convicted him was now in handcuffs himself. 5 years. 5 years of hell, of silence, of injustice. And it had taken his dog, his loyal, steadfast Ranger, to set it right. The judge sat back in stunned silence. Jim's lawyer, who had fought for him for years, wiped his eyes. Even the jury looked shaken, because the truth was undeniable now. Jim Walker was innocent, and his K-9 had just exposed the real guilty man. The judge finally exhaled. "Sergeant Walker," he said, voice heavy with something that almost sounded like regret, "you are fully exonerated of all charges." Jim let out a shaky breath. Then he knelt beside Ranger, his hands shaking as he ran them through the dog's fur. "You did it, boy," he whispered. Ranger whined softly, pressing against him, tail wagging. They had taken everything from him, but they hadn't taken his loyalty. And now he was going home. The prison doors groaned open. For the first time in 5 years, Sergeant James Jim Walker stepped out as a free man. The sun was blinding. The air smelled clean, untouched by the cold sterility of a prison cell. The world had moved on without him, but today, none of that mattered. Jim breathed in deeply, slowly, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. Relief, freedom, but also unfinished business. Because he wasn't whole yet, not without Ranger, the dog who had saved his life. The dog who had exposed the truth. The dog who had reminded the world that Jim Walker wasn't a murderer. And now, they wanted to take him away. Jim sat in a military review office, surrounded by men in suits, medals pinned to their chests, their expressions cold and calculating. "You've been cleared of all charges," one of them droned. "You're a free man, Walker, but that doesn't mean you get to keep the dog." Jim's jaw tightened. "Ranger isn't just a dog, he's my partner." "Ranger is military property," the official shot back. He was reassigned, he's still active duty, and the military doesn't just give away trained K-9 units. Jim's fingers curled into fists. He had spent years in a cage for a crime he didn't commit, and now they wanted to take the only thing left that mattered to him. "He's not just property," Jim said, his voice low and dangerous. "You saw what happened in that courtroom. He never forgot me. He still listens to me. He still obeys me." Silence. Then another officer, Colonel Davis, leaned forward. He had been watching Jim closely, his sharp blue eyes unreadable. "Walker, do you even know what happens to dogs like Ranger when they retire?" Jim's breath stilled. "What?" The room stayed silent. Jim's stomach dropped. "They put them down," Colonel Davis said flatly. "Not all of them, but most. The government doesn't like liability, and these dogs, well, they're considered too dangerous for civilian life." Jim's world shifted. His fingernails dug into the arms of his chair. He had seen men killed in war, had buried his friends, had endured a prison sentence meant to break him. But this was different. They were going to kill Ranger after everything the dog had done, after saving Jim's life, after saving lives overseas, after exposing a murderer. They were going to erase him. Jim's vision darkened. His body went still. "No," he said, his voice deadly calm. "That's not happening." The officers exchanged glances. "You don't have a say in this," the first one snapped. Jim slowly leaned forward, staring Davis down. "You have no legal ground to keep him," Jim countered. "He's no longer an active military dog. He's a retired veteran, and I am requesting custody." Davis's lips twitched. "Even if that were possible, the paperwork alone takes months," he said. "By then, he'll be..." He didn't finish. Jim's blood boiled. Davis exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You're a pain in the ass, Walker." Jim didn't move. Then Davis sighed. "Fine." Jim didn't breathe. "Fine," he repeated. Davis nodded. "I'll make the call. Ranger is yours, but God help you if he bites someone." Jim felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in years. "Don't worry," he said. "He only bites the bad guys." Jim stood outside a fenced facility, his hands shaking. The gate creaked open, and inside, he saw a line of military K9 dogs in kennels, waiting for their assignments. Then, a blur of fur and muscle charged forward. Jim barely had time to react before Ranger barreled into him, knocking him back onto the ground. The dog's tail was wagging so hard it looked like it might fly off, his whines breaking through years of discipline. Jim just laughed. Yeah, I missed you too, boy." But then he felt it. The way Ranger pressed against him, the way he refused to let go. Jim closed his eyes, his fingers curling into the dog's fur. "I got you," he whispered. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jim felt whole again. But it wasn't over, because Holloway was still out there, and he knew Jim was coming. Jim sat in his truck, Ranger in the passenger seat, watching a high-security estate through binoculars. Inside, Brigadier General Marcus Holloway, the man behind everything. The man who had orchestrated Reese's murder, the man who had framed Jim for it, the man who had tried to bury it all. Jim exhaled slowly, setting the binoculars down. He turned to Ranger, his old war dog, his brother, his last remaining family. "You ready, boy?" Ranger's ears twitched. Then he growled. Jim smirked. "Let's go end this." The headlights of Jim's truck cut through the thick night air, illuminating the private estate of Brigadier General Marcus Holloway, the man who had taken everything from him, the man who had framed him, the man who had sent him to rot in a concrete box for 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. Jim sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, his breath steady but slowly burning with rage. Beside him, Ranger sat alert, his sharp eyes locked on the entrance of the compound. The estate was a fortress, guarded by ex-military security, high walls, and surveillance cameras on every corner. Breaking in? Impossible. Unless you were already on the inside. Jim reached into his jacket and pulled out a stolen key card, courtesy of Frankie Morales, his inside contact. "Hope you're watching, Holloway," Jim muttered under his breath. "Because I'm coming for you." He reached over, ruffling Ranger's fur. "You ready, boy?" Ranger didn't wag his tail. He just growled, low and lethal. Jim smirked. "Yeah, me too." Getting past the outer wall was easy. Security was focused on the main entrance, so Jim took the back way. He moved fast, silent, precise, his military training kicking in like muscle memory. Every movement was calculated, every step was rehearsed in his head. This wasn't just revenge, this was war. As he crouched behind a stack of crates, he saw 2 armed guards patrolling the side of the property. Jim reached down and tapped Ranger's side twice. A silent command. Ranger tensed, locked in, waiting. As soon as the first guard passed, Jim whistled low. The sound made both men turn sharply. Before either could react, Ranger was already moving. The dog lunged from the shadows, his powerful body slamming into the first guard, taking him down with a single brutal bite to the arm. The man let out a muffled scream, his weapon clattering onto the pavement. The second guard reached for his radio. Jim was faster. He wrapped an arm around the man's throat, twisting sharply. A single, precise maneuver. The guard dropped instantly, unconscious. Jim exhaled, patting Ranger. "Good boy." The dog licked the blood off his muzzle and waited for his next command. They were in. The inside of Holloway's estate reeked of money and corruption. Walls covered in framed medals, certificates, photos with high-ranking officials, all a facade. Jim moved quickly, knowing he didn't have much time. Holloway wouldn't be alone. As he reached a side hallway, he heard muffled voices. Jim pressed against the wall, listening. "They're making a mistake reopening Walker's case." Holloway's voice, cold, arrogant, dismissive. He should have never walked out of that prison. Jim clenched his jaw. They had never intended to let him live. Holloway wasn't just covering up Reese's murder. He was making sure there were no loose ends. Jim was the last loose end. Not anymore. Jim moved fast, creeping along the hall until he reached the door where the voices were coming from. He took a breath, steadied himself, then kicked the door open. Holloway sat behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by 2 bodyguards, each armed. The second the door slammed open, the guns were raised. Jim didn't hesitate. He grabbed the first bodyguard's wrist, twisting it hard enough to disarm him, before driving his elbow into the man's face. The second fumbled to aim his weapon. Ranger lunged, clamping his jaws onto the man's leg. The guard screamed, dropping his gun as Ranger yanked him to the floor. Now it was just Holloway. The general hadn't moved. He just sat there, calm, collected, like a man who thought he still had the upper hand. Jim grabbed the second guard's pistol from the ground and aimed it directly at Holloway's head. "You know why I'm here?" Jim said. Holloway exhaled, leaning back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk. "5 years, Walker," he murmured, "and you still think you have control?" Jim didn't respond. "You're a soldier," Holloway continued. "You know how this works. You're nothing now. No rank, no resources, no power. And you really think a prison dog and a stolen gun change that?" Jim's fingers tightened on the trigger. "You murdered Reese," Jim said, voice calm. "You framed me. You sent me away. And when that didn't work, you tried to have me killed." Holloway didn't deny it. That only infuriated Jim more. "You should have stayed in prison, Walker," Holloway said, his smirk widening. "Because out here, you don't stand a chance." Jim's heartbeat slowed. "Yeah," he murmured, "that's what you think." Then he tossed a small device onto Holloway's desk, a recording device, still blinking red. The general's face dropped. Jim leaned in, his voice cold, lethal. "You just confessed." Before Holloway could reach for a weapon, Jim raised the gun and shot once, right into the general's shoulder. The man roared in pain, crashing back into his chair. Jim didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched as the walls closed in on the man who had stolen his life. Ranger stood beside him, staring Holloway down. Outside, sirens wailed. Military MPs stormed the compound, their boots pounding against the marble floors. Jim didn't even raise his hands. He just waited. 2 armed soldiers grabbed Holloway, ripping him out of his chair, forcing him to his knees. The lead MP officer stormed in, his gaze locking on Jim. "Walker!" the officer barked. "You got something to say before I haul you out of here?" Jim smirked, nodding toward Holloway. "Yeah, arrest that bastard." The officer hesitated, then turned to Holloway. "Brigadier General Marcus Holloway," he said, his voice flat. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice." Holloway went pale. Wait, you can't." But the soldiers had already dragged him to his feet. Jim stood completely still, watching as the man who had stolen his life was finally dragged away. Holloway caught his eye one last time. "You'll never be free of this," he hissed. Jim just smirked. "I already am." A week later, Jim and Ranger stood on a dusty road, staring at an open highway. His name was cleared, his freedom was restored. And Ranger? The military had officially granted Jim full custody. "Where to now?" Jim muttered, stretching his arms. Ranger just wagged his tail. Jim chuckled, stepping toward his truck. "Yeah, I figured you wouldn't care." The engine rumbled to life, and as they pulled away, heading toward a new beginning, Jim knew one thing for certain. No matter where they went, they were finally free.